Hot topic of the day, how to avoid or prevent that front suspension dive on your Harley Davidson, or in fact, any motorcycle. Let's get into it.
RevelatorAlf.
Hello, welcome to RevelatorAlf. I hope you're all well. So here I'm talking about suspension on a Harley Davidson, but you can apply this logic to all motorcycles. And if you've got a front suspension setup, especially that you cannot adjust for preload, for compression, for a rebound, whatever it is, basically you've just got a static setup from the factory, a stock setup, and you can't do anything. The only thing you can adjust, let's say like on my motorcycle here, the Sport Glide, you can only adjust the rear suspension for preload, and you've got the different settings according to your weight. So the factory, the manufacturer, already work out what your suspension setting should be, your preload should be, based upon your weight. Now, you might have heard of terms of sag, whether it's front suspension sag, rear suspension sag, static sag, dynamic sag. Basically, all that is the amount that the suspension compresses under the load of the motorcycle itself, and also with the load of the rider and or the passenger and all your bags as well. It really depends how much it's going to compress and then how effective it's going to be afterwards. So you basically want to have a certain amount of travel still left in that suspension in order for it to be effective. So this video isn't about how you set that up. Basically, if you've got a stock bike, let's say like this, and you've got stock suspension, there's very limited changes that you can make, especially with a front suspension setup that hasn't got the little dials on top of the forks there that you can change the compression and the rebound. So what are you going to do? Okay, so there are two options. First option is, well, many people mock the Harley Davidson suspension, especially on the Taurus. On the Softails, not so much. The number one thing you do is swap out your suspension. Yeah, you could spend a couple of $1,000s and change that all up. Now, I've made videos about this before, especially for the Softails and the Sport Glide here. You could change the front and rear suspension for an Olin setup, a Legend setup, something like that. You can change the springs on the front suspension, put progressive springs in there. You can put harder springs in there that are harder to compress, so you can have a harder ride. In the olden days, let's say, of front forks, we could change the springs, but also we could put spacers in there to make the suspension longer, so it would have more travel. Doesn't make it any better, but just gives you more travel with that suspension, so that in many ways you're changing the sag, the static sag and the dynamic sag of the motorcycle, of that front suspension setup. However, modern motorcycles are slightly different, and it really depends what motorcycle you've got. So let's say if you've got a sports replica bike, yeah, you can make all the modifications, all the changes on the fly, as it were. You can set up your front suspension and your rear suspension by tuning it in according to what your weight is and the kind of riding that you're going to do. Whether you want softer suspension, or let's say you're going to take your bike to the track and you're really going to be ripping it on, then you might want to harden up that suspension, stiffen it up a little bit, and that's going to make you go around the track a little bit quicker, of course, but also the ride won't be as comfortable. But let's say if you're going on a long motorcycle tour on a sports bike, for example, you don't really want hard suspension, so you might want to soften it down a bit. That's essentially the manual adjustment on the front suspension. You'll harden it up or you'll soften it down according to the kind of riding that you're going to do. It's exactly the same with the rear suspension setup. Regardless of what age of motorcycle it is, you would just change the setting according to the weight of the rider and the kind of comfort level that you want on that ride. Okay, some motorcycles have electronic suspension and it's all preset in the algorithm of the motorcycle computer, so there's not a lot you can do with the standard settings. However, in custom settings, depending on the motorcycle that you have, may enable you to change the front suspension setting and the rear suspension setting according to the preference that you have, your weight and your riding style, and also the kind of ride that you're going to do. Now, if you get custom suspension, let's say Legends, Öhlins, then yes, you can manually adjust the suspension setting to adjust the sag, the static sag and the dynamic sag with you as the weight on there as well, so that the suspension is perfectly set up for the motorcycle, you as the rider and or the pillion, and also the kind of ride that you're going to do. But with stock suspension, you've only got limited changes that you can do on certain motorcycles. Let's say on older motorcycles, you could only adjust the rear suspension setup. Well, that's exactly what we've got on these Harley Davidsons here. So you could have a situation where you're riding along and you're braking and the front wants to dive in. So how are you going to prevent that on a stock setup? Okay, so this comes down to braking technique and braking efficiency. Okay, so the front brakes will be your most efficient brakes and they will take most of the stopping power. However, with that, there's a lot more force on the front tyre and also the front suspension, hence why it will tend to dive. If you want to try and stop that dive or minimize that dive, you could change the suspension if you could, or change the suspension settings if you could, to make it harder. Therefore, on a racetrack, for example, you'd have harder suspension so you could brake without having the dive. With that dive, the rear tyre becomes unloaded and the tyre becomes very light on the road surface or the track surface or whatever, so the braking efficiency on the rear is even worse. All the weight of the motorcycle and the rider is propelled forward as well, so you've got everything that is working on that front brake and also the front suspension, hence why it wants to dive. The weight wants to go forward and also all the pressure is going on the front suspension, but the rear suspension is doing nothing. Okay, this has been a really long video to explain what you can do, but basically from racing terms, let's say, what you can do, you can actually load up the front suspension. And what I mean by that is that you can, when you want to stop the motorcycle or slow down, instead of just using all the front brake, you can actually just squeeze on a little bit of the front brake and that will start to compress the front suspension. You're not really applying a lot of braking force, but you're just loading it up a little bit. At the same time, you're adding rear brake as well, and that will pull the rear of the bike down. That will compress the rear of the bike. So now you're actually, instead of diving the front end, you're actually pulling the rear end down and you're actually slowing down like that. You're pulling both wheels down in towards the ground, as it were, or both suspension into the ground, and then you can progressively add more braking pressure to the front and to the rear. Now, many people might call this adding the rear brake, trail braking, tail dragging, all this kind of stuff. There's lots of different terms for it, but essentially you're trying to load up the rear suspension as well as the front suspension so that you're both loading the suspension at the same time, but you're not overloading the front suspension to cause a dive. As you're starting to brake, you're progressively adding more and more braking pressure. Now, in an emergency situation, yes, the chances are you're still going to add more braking pressure to the front of the bike, the front suspension, but you can still add a lot of braking efficiency from the rear brake and also the rear suspension just by adding that rear brake as well. Now, as you can imagine, this is a huge subject. And if you go on YouTube, there are hundreds and hundreds of videos about sag, setting up the sag on your motorcycle, the front suspension sag, rear suspension sag, dynamic sag, static sag. It goes on and on and on for Harleys, in motorcycles in general, sports bikes, you know, and it's one of those things that you've got to fine tune it. However, this video is not really about setting up your bike. This is about you getting on your bike and finding that it's not right for you. So in between you having this problem and then finally figuring out how to fix the suspension issue that you might be having, or the braking issue you might be having, how can you combat that? And you can combat that by partially loading the front suspension with light braking, loading up the rear suspension with heavier braking, and that will bring your motorcycle frame closer to the ground and a more level braking, as it were, so your suspension is working in unison rather than working independently. If you're diving, you're unloading the rear suspension, and basically you're going to lose traction on the rear, which is not a good thing, and you're going to lose braking efficiency on the rear as well. Now, many people talk about Harley Davidson suspension, especially, you know, in our world, Harley Davidson world, and say how bad it is. And basically, whenever I tend to ride a bike, whatever it is, I always tend to adopt this braking style, this riding style. And it basically relieves the braking pressure on the front, but also relieves all the pressure on the front suspension, so that I'm braking more efficiently. Now, a lot of modern bikes are using dual link brakes as well, and that's essentially what they're doing. They're allowing you to preload the suspension or load the suspension front and rear pretty much at the same time. Yes, there might be a pressure valve there that adds more braking pressure to the front as opposed to the rear, but essentially you're braking at the same time, and that's what you are doing in a manual sense to avoid that dive on the front suspension. Okay, hope you found that useful. But yes, you might want to change the front suspension, the rear suspension for uprated shocks, let's say, from Legends, from Öhlins, from Wilburs, whatever it is. Depends on whatever bike you're riding, of course. Harley Davidson, if you've got another bike, a Triumph, a Honda, a Suzuki, whatever it is, yeah, you could look into upgraded suspension for those as well. But essentially, most of the time, you don't really need to do this. You don't need to add spacers in there. You just need to change your braking style, and that will give you the braking efficiency and the suspension performance that you've been craving this whole time. Let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell, like and share. Check out the website, RevelatorAlf.com. Sorry about the long video, but it takes a while to explain this part. Ta-da!